Hey, Lewis, thank you for coming in. I love your background. You are embedded in machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's just an incredible history of development and innovation and building communities and really launching things that will have impact in some way and in fact globally as well. So you're definitely a leader. And
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the compliment.
So Louis, my audience is actually quite diverse. As you know, my interviews appear in all of these scientific communities and engineering communities. But when I actually track my audience, it's scientists and engineers, people in AI machine learning, but there's a lot of CEOs as well, and investors and board members. In fact, they actually rank higher. I get more CEOs watching my interviews than other groups, and it could be because of my background, but so keep in mind, you got students, so it's pretty diverse.
Right.
One of the questions that my audience always asks me about is that, you're interviewing these amazing people who have these wonderful professional and personal careers, and they're always curious about what enabled all of the success you're having and all of the different things that you're doing. What were the inflection points? And it could have been when you were really young, or it could have been someone in your family, or some points in your career or education. It could be anything, but let me know maybe two or three that's really shaped you to doing all of this amazing work.
Right. So I think there's probably different components, and keep in mind that I'm also quite young still in the career. So a lot of this is quite recent developments from the last like 10 years or so. But I think for me there are a couple of components. So one is obviously the ML part and kind of the promise of using data transformation, automated data transformation to achieve new levels of scale to solve problems. And I think the way I came into ML into this attraction towards automation was from a completely tangential field, namely quantitative finance. So when I was a young student, I used algorithms mainly to do arbitrage betting for sports. So this was actually the angle I came into, and I dug deeper and deeper. And when you reach a certain point with kind of quantitative analysis for automated transactions, you kind of start thinking more about, okay, if we invest all these brainwaves into such an activity, what kind of 10, 20, 30 years down the line actually stays? And with all the finance and trading, though it's its own really interesting and healthy field in terms of method, and it has a bunch of very smart people, I had this feeling that, hey, there has to be this added layer to it in terms of purpose. And that's how I started venturing into health and trying to kind of build communities around problems that need solving. And the big question there also is, how do you identify these problems, these kind of high impact tasks that have a promise to really bring a lot of utility to many people. So that's kind of my entry point to ML, and then kind of the transformation towards health applications of it. I think the other component is community building, and I mean it's this is always, if you come from science, it's kind of a natural element because you're involved and embedded with conferences, with your research groups and things like that. But I think where I really saw firsthand the impact it can have to bring together some very talented people without money, volunteer-based, to rally behind a problem was in the work we did in the focus group together with ITU. I mean, you have been part of that as well. And I think we basically just started out in the beginning as a loose group of enthusiasts, and together with Pat Beard from Philips, we nurtured this into a working group concerned with like data and AI assessment initially. And we kind of thought a bit about what was missing in the space, identified kind of like a kind of principle or theory to practice gap quite early on in terms of practical application of auditing and assessment frameworks in healthcare with AI, and basically assembled a team, did a broad study with 3 different use cases, and then presented that at I think the NeurIPS AI for Health workshop in 2020, and that was really an interesting experience because we had such a fast turnaround in terms of idea to actual implementation, and that really showed me how much you can do with people who all share a mission and are motivated to deliver something innovative and new to the community.
So that's really interesting. You had this early interest in applying algorithms into sort of the financial services space.
Exactly.
Sports, and so on. And then you shifted into healthcare and impact. And you then joined this focus group AI for Health, which is a joint initiative of the United Nations International Telecommunications Union, which is a really old UN agency. It's almost 160 years old. And the World Health Organization, where they're looking at producing some kind of standards and benchmarking for AI solutions in healthcare. And you realize that you could use your machine learning interests and skills into this area, and you got traction, right? And because of this interest you have and this group that's there. And this program is now scaling, and you talk about NeurIPS. Some people in the audience, especially maybe more the CEOs and people like that in my audience, may not know that NeurIPS is like one of the top 1 or 2 AI sort of research-oriented conferences in the world today. And in fact, Canada used to host it for many, many years because
That's
Canada.
Right.
The Canadian government used to fund deep learning when there was the kind of like the AI winter. So without Canadian funding, this what we see today wouldn't have been possible. So that's really, really fascinating. And I know you're a key leader in these programs. But even earlier than that, when you were very young, were you interested in science and mathematics and so on? And then that shaped your interest into this area?
I think my interest as a teenager or even as a kid was usually quite broad. So this may sound like a bit pretentious, right? So you have to be careful in like self-describing yourself. But if I look back, I think I usually kind of like you could say like a dot connector or something like that. So I really like to bring together people, develop a vision, and try to put that through. So when I was a kid, I remember one of the first projects actually we did had nothing to do with technology at all. It was like an art exhibition in Berlin, and you have to imagine the following situation. So right, like you are like underage, so you have basically no ability to sign any contracts, things like that, and you have barely any money, right? Because at least I didn't have a lot. I mean, at that time, it was like just kind of normal teenage life, and we sat together with a few friends and thought, okay, we want to host an exhibition. Which people don't really know or understand it's an exhibition. We just want to rent an apartment and then let people kind of walk in. And the question there was really how can you get this done? And I remember we were putting putting up all kinds of crazy ideas. In the end, what we had to do is convince some housing company to let us sign a contract, even though we are underage. I don't know how they, managed to kind of sign off on this, but somehow we did, and get together the funds to make sure we have some kind of sustainability for this project, so it can actually run, and then obviously get together the artwork, and this is, I think, like the type of activity that I usually gravitate to, is trying to find some ingredients and finding the right people at the right time, and trying to make the idea come to life and make it work. And that's something I enjoyed, I think, already from quite an early age, and that has carried through throughout my career so far, whether it's in research or what we are doing now here in Switzerland with building up this company. It's usually about these types of components, coming up with an idea that you can rally behind, get some really exciting people that also believe in that vision and are a bit crazy, and really push in that direction, and then take a big shot at getting it done, and hopefully then it flies.
That's really fascinating. I've been doing these interviews since like the 80s or 70s, a long time, and I've interviewed a really broad spectrum of some of the most effective people in the world today, and many of them have these similar attributes: a very interdisciplinary, broad thinking, willing to delve into very innovative new kinds of ideas, and then just working like crazy to make it happen. And that's a definition of an entrepreneur too. Right? So
okay, well, I take it, though. Like I said, you always have to be careful, right, with these self-ascribed, as many people calling themselves the greatest things. So that's what I mean. It's always a fine line of focusing on what you want to do, and this kind of categories. But I see what you mean. Definitely, it's one way to kind of look at it, and I think really engaging or driving activity. That's for sure.
Now, you're also, as I mentioned, so I can see now your entrepreneurial roots. I can see your interest in algorithms. I can see your interest in community, because you realize the importance that you can't just do it alone. You have to build capacity, or do capacity building by getting other people involved, and getting them impassioned and committed to these different kinds of programs. And I can see now why you're part of Dotphoton. So talk about Dotphoton.
Right. So this is also, it's similar, right? It fits kind of the bill of those previous projects. So during my PhD research in Berlin, which mainly comprised machine learning robustness in healthcare. So all things machine learning systems in healthcare, how to make them more reliable, things like uncertainty quantification for neural networks, and systems to audit them. Also, what we did in the focus group that you mentioned. And early on, I worked with some of the colleagues from Switzerland here at Dotphoton, because one thing we realized along this journey is that you are really rate limited by the degree of access you have to the data generating process. So this is like a mouthful, but I try to disentangle a bit what at least what I mean by that. So in machine learning, we start with some input, then we have the kind of the prime time object, which is the machine learning model that we train and do all kinds of nice things, and then it usually does really amazing things. And when we want to get it into production, it turns out there are often a lot of different nuanced failure modes. And one primary source of failure is changes in the data generating process, right? So you might train your model on data from a certain microscope in a certain hospital, and then you want to deploy it and scale it across the world to realize all that potential with scalability. And it turns out that in other environments where the data is maybe slightly different because it's a different geographic location or the microscope has different settings, it doesn't work as well. And then we have this whole problem, right? If we scale things up, we also scale up problems, and we also need to scale up the monitoring of problems, because if you have one bad case in 1,000 in a local hospital, that might be manageable. But if you want to kind of scale this up without oversight, you need a better kind of degree of certainty about the behavior of your system. So, and that you can really only do if you look at what happens beyond the machine learning model itself. So staying with this concept of the microscope, what we started looking into is how can we kind of connect these two things? How can we connect the acquisition hardware with the machine learning model itself, so that we have a kind of complete package and also full observability, right? So that we can go into the microscope and understand with gradient descent, just as we train the model, similarly understand in the data generating process in the microscope, how sensitive is the downstream task model to changes in the kind of data acquisition. And that started as a research kind of endeavor as part of these initiatives that we talked about. And then we thought, okay, I think we are onto something here, because this is a recurring problem all over the place. Let's try to get this integration right and make it more mature. And that's what we're here to do now at Dotphoton. It's basically connecting the machine learning models with the acquisition hardware and ensure data quality and the extraction of value from data. With the headline always is observability. We want to be able to access as much as possible along this pipeline so that we can give these kind of guarantees and controls and make them reliable, these systems, so that they can actually be used and people can trust them. And that's the main project that we're doing here. And how this always is, right? When you're in an ecosystem and you meet people, and usually I'm very receptive to these kind of for exciting new ideas. So we have a couple of satellite projects also in Africa, where we experiment with hardware development itself, right? So in Europe, we have a pretty mature ecosystem of vendors and manufacturers for kind of these scientific or laboratory devices. But another kind of vector of growth in this space is also coming up with new low-cost hardware that can realize the gains of machine learning at a lower price point, and so to make them available to more people. If we talk about healthcare, it's usually about access to healthcare in the first place. And so this is kind of the mix that we are in with Dotphoton.
So it sounds like then you develop methods and processes and tools to identify failure kind of models and machine learning systems and enhancing their performance for reliable real-world application using microscopes, and whether this is in developed or developing countries, and particularly sensitive in developing countries because they don't have the access to the same kind of hardware, and they're doing this through real and synthetic data. So generative AI, that sort of other side of generative AI, not the ChatGPT side, but just sort of the synthetic data side. And you've done it in a novel way, right? So that it makes it more trustworthy what's happening. Does that capture what you're doing?
Yes, that's accurate. So I think the USP, you could say, for our approach is that we are physically faithful, right? So we want to be able to look someone in the eye. And I mean, to be honest, right, this is not just like a fancy scientific ideal. It has some real, like if you go into practice with these things, it's just some real industry constraints. That's the reality of, that's the sanity check when you take these things into the real world. If you want to deploy something on a satellite, or if you want to collaborate with large hardware manufacturers, there are a bunch of constraints that you have to fulfill and a bunch of answers you have to be able to provide. And if you cannot give these about data quality, about performance of your model in different environments, it's basically a showstopper, right? So that's the other component to it. So what we are trying to do to satisfy these constraints is to be exactly in the physical spec of the data generating process. So imagine, right, like if you have a microscope, you can usually model that physically accurate step by step, what happens, right, from the moment the photon hits the lens all the way to the kind of final post-process image that the machine learning model will see. And that's really the uniqueness of our angle here, because we are a group of quantum physicists and machine learning researchers, and trying to kind of bring these two worlds together so that we can solve this problem of underspecified data changes.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Does this work also then tie in with what you've done also, where you co-developed a data-centric library and data management system for optical data machine learning at raw-to-logic?
Yes, so that's kind of my approach usually is to say, okay, to have like a bull's eye in the middle of a vision, and then kind of organize activity around it in layers that create synergy towards that vision. So Dotphoton is kind of our commercial contribution, or our development in a commercial context towards that vision of scaling data-centric machine learning systems to production. But there's other components to that. And another important one is this standardization and kind of open source convergence towards common infrastructure, right? Because imagine the problem of data loading that you brought up with Croissant, is that if everybody speaks kind of their own language, we have the old Babylon problem that things are not interfacing, and in order to have those kind of compounding effects across systems, right? Like if one person creates a data set and another person or entity wants to use that data set, but the transaction costs of making that bridge are so high that it is impossible, then we lose out on a lot of opportunities. And what we're trying to do with Croissant is to develop that kind of Google Translate for data. So that's a common schema for managing machine learning and AI data sets that will be supported by most of the major platforms, or your Kagglers and Hugging Faces and Google TensorFlow and OpenML, to be able to kind of get that bridge done between silos, right? So if you are hosting a data set, you can do your own workflow the way you normally do it. And if you support the Croissant schema on top, what this means is that someone else with a completely different workflow, right, can just use the Croissant interface as a switch to use your data set in their workflow. And we hope that this will be a contribution to create more of those compounding situations where somebody does something and someone else can then use it to bring impact in an area which the first person maybe has not even thought about in the first place.
Wow, that's really interesting. So I'm kind of old school, where we used to build drivers and then write in machine code and assembler, then C and so on. It's like an operating system.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that it's an operating system for data, and I would even add to that. But I think the operating system analogy, or this Google Translate, that's already there. The first spec is out, and we will formally launch it to the entire community at ICML on Hawaii and at the end of July. So that's roughly in 2 weeks. But kind of the moonshot, I think, if we talk a bit about crazy ideas and things that drive us forward, I think is to also consider organizing data in this space or making it as usable as the internet is to us today, right? So a lot of, I mean, if you are in machine learning practice, you will know that a lot of the wrangling part is just that, right? You have some hospital and they use some DICOM, and then your PyTorch has a certain setup, and just getting those two things to jail, getting the tiling right, making sure that you batch the data in the right way. All those kind of rote things that always happen over and over. But if you have varying formats, you kind of have to always adapt on a per format basis. Getting that to a point where you just share a link and you have a lazy and scalable architecture that allows this type of sharing. I think that's really the big headline in the distance for this whole croissant project. But like I said, I usually try to create these onion layers around this bullseye, around this core. So that's also what we are contributing on the infrastructure side with Dotphoton, and hopefully then in 10 years we don't have to complain anymore about transforming data in the right format, but it will just be we all have a laugh, and people won't believe that this was ever a hard thing.
Right. So I could see why then things like Hugging Face would be part of this sort of planning, right? Because you to make things so much easier. It could definitely increase efficiencies and scale, allow rapid scaling. That's really interesting work. And then you indicated that you're going to present this at ICML, which to the audience, again, I got a lot of CEOs and people like that. They may not be familiar with ICML. Can you talk about what is ICML? And we sort of talked about NeurIPS, but can you get into more detail about these two major conferences?
Right. So, I mean, in general, I would say in the field of machine learning and AI, there are like three historic or traditional top conferences. First two you already mentioned is NeurIPS. Second one is ICML, the International Conference on Machine Learning. It has its 40th anniversary this year. And then the third one is ICLR or ICLR, which is more focused on representation learning. It was hosted in first time on the African continent this year in Rwanda, which was a really impressive and fascinating event. And these three are kind of the top three most cited and most prestigious machine learning conferences. And then there are others really good ones, like CVPR is more focused on vision and things like that. So there's more in this space. But if you are an ML, you usually want to be at these conferences, present there, or have workshops there. And we are this year organizing the launch of a new community which features this dataset standard that we talked about, and then the venue itself. So the physical meeting is another component of that community, and it is called DMLR. It's data-centric machine learning research. And we have a wonderful lineup. Andrew Ng is going to be there speaking. We have Peter Madsen, Isabelle Guyon, so some really OG machine learning people, and then also the kind of young and wild next generation of researchers. And the other part of that will be a new journal that lives under the umbrella of JMLR. So that's maybe more for the again for the research community, but for those who don't know, so we have those three conferences in machine learning and AI, and then we have the journals. And we are lucky in this space that we have a very healthy, open research community. So all the top journals in machine learning are community maintained, and there's no weird open access fees or anything. It's just kind of by the people for the people style. And GMLR is the most prestigious one. And under that, we will host a new journal focused on data-centric methods. And yeah, and that's kind of the package for that workshop. And we will have socials. So if there's younger people in the audience or students who kind of looking for ways to engage or to connect, there will be socials at ICML and recurring meetings. And for people who already know, the rules of the game and are looking just for like networking, there's also regular meetings for steering this type of activity together with Machine Learning Commons, a group based on the West Coast in the US, and organized by Peter Metzen, who one of the few people from this group, although he's the boss, he also sits here in Switzerland, in Zurich. He based at Google. And yeah, and he has been really instrumental also in kind of rallying some important people together to have some momentum behind some of these activities.
Okay, so let me kind of summarize what you've been talking about for the last few minutes, and then I'll ask a question. So what I'm hearing is you've come up with this new sort of data common standard in a sense, right? So that you can separate, and as you mentioned, as a Google Translate between these different formats so that people can work together, right? And you've been presenting this work at various events, including other work such as ICML, UDL, NeurIPS, the Machine Learning for Health, the ICLR, Robust ML, the BVM, SAIL, ACM Chill, NeurIPS, Physics and Machine Learning, the ITU, WHO, and A-Alpha Health meetings, and you've been co-chairing international conferences, including the Machine Learning for Health, but you'll probably talk about these things in the USA and virtually in 2022 and 2021. And there's this ICML 2023, the Data-Centric Machine Learning Research Workshop, which sounds really exciting, right? But now it's becoming like its own summit. And the end of 2022 Trustworthy AI Workshop, which is in Tunisia, the ICLR 2023 Practical Machine Learning for Developing Countries Workshop, which I think is really interesting, Rwanda, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm hearing is what was initially thought of as a workshop associated with things like NeurIPS or ICML or ICLR has now become its own summit in itself with a physical meeting. And Andrew Ng, I think you mentioned, will be there, and some people who are really considered some of the pioneers who are students of people like Jeffrey Hinton, who got the Turing Award for their work. And then you're going to have this work summit now to progress this work, and this is leading to journals and so on. Did I capture that right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's usually, it happens organically. So once you realize, it was similar with ML4H, it started as a NeurIPS workshop, and then there was so much momentum behind it, and we published our own proceedings that NeurIPS at some point said, okay, guys, this is a bit too big of a show for a little workshop. Please book your own hotel room and take care of logistics. So it happens in this organic way that once there's a signal from the community for interest and activity and momentum, it grows into its own thing, and that's the best way these things can develop, because you need that grassroots component if you want to do community-driven kind of the standards part of that work. Right? There's spaces maybe in individual projects or companies where it's good to focus, have a small team, and get things going. But if you are about convergence, and I mean, you are the AI for good inventor, so you understand this better than me, the importance of kind of bringing people together and then having like a ecosystem around it that can sustain that and actually keep it alive over a longer period of time.
And again, because you're building a community and you're so in tune with building communities, have you submitted anything to the ACM community or the communications of ACM, which is their kind of flagship? It's more of a sort of a combination magazine and journal. Have you done things?
No,
like
I haven't. Happy to look into that. It sounds very fascinating, and I mean, any opportunity to kind of get the word out through editorials or like conversations like this, where you can meet and discuss these types of topics with like-minded people. It's always appreciated and great.
Yeah, I mean, this is an unscripted interview, so I'm just kind of brainstorming live with you. I've been asked to host the Generative AI Summit, and I'm going to now present your name for that because I realize it's a good fit.
Okay.
And I've been asked, I actually wrote the sort of the agenda for a conference, an IEEE conference. And though I'm not part of the membership committee, they asked me because I can usually write these things up pretty quickly. And in fact, we have a meeting on Friday of the organizing committee, and I'm going to be one of the keynotes. But now I'm going to recommend you be a keynote of this IEEE
Sure.
conference, and it's a conference of all of the major societies within organizations with IEEE. They belong to this common community of this conference. So God, I'm thinking that would be a good fit. I'm just gonna. And I'm hearing
Sure.
you're interested, right? So I'll present your name, and
Happy to.
I just love this idea that you spun out from a workshop, and New is saying, "Hey, fellas, this is our people, girls and
Right.
women, and I should say, this is too big for us. You're gonna have to spin this off." That's great, right? I mean, you must be really excited, right? Like kind of jazz.
Yes. I mean, that's like I said, right? That's the best way these the best or the best case scenario how these communities can grow is basically there's so much involvement and excitement that people tell you to get your own room or own space because it's outgrowing the format that it was originally conceived in. And that's I mean what we've been doing for the past few years. Last year in New Orleans. Actually, it will be again in New Orleans this year, ML4H in December, and it continued to be its own symposium. It's now called. So it's a 1-day conference, and last year we had some amazing keynotes. Also, then the years before. With I think Andrew also presented 1 year, and we had Joshua Benjo and Emmanuel Candet and some just very great speakers. So I think it's on a good path to really stabilize. And we see also now the next batch of younger PhD students coming in and helping with the organization. So that's always a good sign, right? When this one generation of people moves a bit to the sideline and sees that there's a new kind of generation of people available and motivated to keep these things alive. That's just really great to see.
I'm just again live brainstorming. I realize this could be a good fit for Alex Wong. Alex Wong is at the University of Waterloo. He's a professor there, and he's got tons of patents, and he's always doing a lot of really interesting work. He's a Canadian research chair at AI as well, and he's founded a company. I'm thinking he'd be such a great fit. I'll talk in case he's not aware of this thing. I'll suggest that he attend.
Send him, like, if he's interested. Also, if you have other people interested in in this kind of ecosystem, whether it's on the methods on infra side regarding data or on the application side on health, this is a very open and all very open and welcoming communities. So new people with new ideas, speakers, always very welcome.
Now, it's something I was curious about. You're working on your PhD at the Department of Artificial Intelligence, but it's associated with Fraunhofer HHI. Does Fraunhofer grant PhDs then, or how does that work?
No, so the setup with Fraunhofer is usually they have a kind of a sibling institution in the city where they're at, and usually the group or department heads, they are a professor and associated with the university, and
Right.
that's how the grant accreditation is handled. So you are usually then holding a researcher position through Fraunhofer, which is actually quite unique, I think, in even in Germany, because it's a pure research PhD, right? So you are not teaching; you have ability, to as we talked about, I have all this community involvement or explore these spaces as well, but there's no teaching obligation, which if you are interested in building projects and building technology, I think is a very unique and appealing kind of setup for young researchers because you get good resources and a lot of opportunity to use them. And I think that's a really kind of unique aspect of the kind of Fraunhofer system in Germany.
Yeah, and just again for the audience, Fraunhofer is one of the world's largest research groups, institutes in the world today. I think their budget is what, 3 or 4 billion euros,
Right.
like 20,000+ researchers. And what's really interesting is they have this big focus on not just research, but translational research, which means
Right.
making it useful so you can do something with it. I can see now why that would be such a perfect environment for you, because you want to do something useful, right?
Right, right. That's a good
Okay.
psychoanalysis. Yes, exactly.
I said I'm just kind of connecting the dots here, why you're there, and of course we both know Thomas Wiegand, and Thomas is such
Yeah,
a famous translational researcher, right? So he'd be the perfect person to be mentored or be part of, and he's the executive director of Fraunhofer HHI. So
exactly.
okay, now I'm getting it.
Yes, yes. No, for sure. That was definitely for me also when considering going into PhD. The main filter is to have that mix of research, the ability to also ask some foundational questions, and at the same time have always that back mirror and looking at like utility and impact and how we can kind of get this translation done. And as you said, Thomas is a very perfect fit for that. Very enterprising and smart leader in this space, and that definitely was a great place to do research.
It's interesting too, just a bit of a side story. I've been on the ACM practitioner board for, I don't know, 12 years or something, a long time. And when I was chairing in that role, I actually nominated Thomas to be on my board. So
Oh,
yeah,
got you. Well, that's how, it's a small circle, a small world in some
yeah,
ways.
yeah, more of these sort of interconnections and things like this, right? And of course, Thomas is the founding chair of this ITU WHO focus group AI for Health. And you're one of the early members of, in fact, a key member, because you have so many great skills in that translational work that's being done in healthcare and AI. Can you talk about how that group, from your perspective, has evolved from its founding in 2018 to what happened just this past week in Geneva it's the first, I guess, in about 4 years now, a face-to-face AI for Good Global Summit, and what it's becoming. And I know there's been news items on this already, and of course Thomas took the stage with the Secretary Generals of these different organizations like ITU and the World Health Organization. I know WIPO is part of this. So So you would have some intimate knowledge of how this is transitioning, but I'd like to get your perspective as a translational researcher, where you think this is going.
Well, if we look back, and that's interesting. I think the focus group, it was not conceived at I Forgot, but it had like its I think third or fourth, so very early, one of the early meetings as well as at I Forgot in 2019. Is that right? I think that was the last one before the pandemic, right? In person before this year's, and I think what you can kind of split the vectors of growth for this group along like two main dimensions. One is this community building aspect that we talked about earlier as well. Is we I think saw quite early that there is a need to engage kind of a global group of stakeholders if you want to come up with like consensus, but also with equitable standards, and not just kind of the usual five CEOs from big companies sitting in a room. But I think from the early design phase of this group, the thought was to say, okay, let's travel around the globe and pick up local communities that work in AI and health to kind of grow a group. And I think that was a big success in terms of the outreach. And then we entered like another phase, which is this second dimension I alluded to, is to get something done. And that I would say was also a success, but more mixed, because you can see the limits of these ambiguous volunteer-driven organization when it comes to executing things. So there is, I think, certain, like if you are very focused with projects, you can rally around that. That's what I mentioned in the beginning with this NeurIPS presentation. So if you have things like that, or like we also built a software platform for auditing, which is hosted on AWS infrastructure inside the ITU tenant of AWS, and it's running as a service. It's health.aiaudit.org, where users can host their own domain-specific audits, and then testers can run their models against these audits and get a standardized kind of focus group ITU WHO report for their model. So these kind of like focused activities were, I think, very successful. But we also kind of hit limits, right? So because if you do community building and implementation at this type of scale with this many stakeholders, you need basically a back office that works full time to coordinate this. And this is also kind of one of the learnings that was basically the ashes for this Phoenix, that is the global initiative now that was launched last week, is to say, okay, look, we have this community in place. We have done some amazing things, but in order to kind of grow this and maintain momentum, we need a bit more structure around that. And that will be one of the, I think, main contributions of the global initiative, with the buy-in from all these organizations that you mentioned, WHO, ITU, and WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. Another really important component in this mix, right? Because probably you and the people watching, they know this all too good themselves. Is like you often, it's very easy to, or it happens often to that you come up with interesting ideas. And then if you have people from different organizations sitting, having a coffee or beer or whatever, and it's like, okay, this problem is clear. We have a kind of sense of what the solution could be. But then you don't have a good framework to get started, because everybody, rightfully so, they're getting worried about money and equity and what's my stake in this. And having some better mechanisms to kind of gel or oil the gears to make these types of interactions speed up and more productive. That is another element. And yeah, I'm looking forward to what we can achieve under this new initiative, and with more and stronger funding. And yeah, that will be something very exciting, I think, to observe.
Yeah, and throughout this conversation, we talked about where you're working with collaborators, you develop methods, processes, and tools to identify failure modes and machine learning systems, enhancing their performance for reliable real-world applications to real and synthetic data. And you've even were part of launching a workshop, which now becomes a summit, and you're now doing journal work and so on. But you've been presenting at all of these different major conferences around the world. We talked about ICML and Near IPS and ICLR and so on. And then within this ITU WHO focus group AI for Health, which is now ended, now it's scaling globally to this global initiative, you actually co-chaired the Data and AI Solutions Assessment Methods Working Group. And you co-authored technical standards, and we talked about this now, such as the global practice for healthcare applications of machine learning, and then this led to the implementation. And you mentioned it's housed under health.aiaudit.org. So you have a platform, an international platform, data model quality assessment, and it's hosted by this UN Commission, AWS structure. And then we talked about, you co-developed this data-centric library and data management system, optical data, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this coming together, and even further kind of institutionalizing on a global level and on a global community level, and getting additional support so you can even do more. And that was the learning you indicated when you're doing the focus group, when you kind of institutionalize it with administration, and you have actual funding to do that, then you could even do more, right? So did that capture then what's happening?
Yes, I think that's a very good summary. And I think moving into the future in this, because it's always a kind of overlaying space, right? You need the infrastructure, you need the technology has to be good, and ideally we are able to create the interfaces so it's standardized. And the other aspect we talked about in the beginning, right, this of picking the relevant high impact tasks. And the kind of intersection between these two is to identify those technologies that actually are mature and have enough bite and traction in reality to realize this impact. And that's another component that we are currently pushing together with Shan. She's also co-chair originally of the focus group, and with this ML4H, Machine Learning for Health symposium that is co-located with NeurIPS, is to basically have this call for demos where we say, okay, if you are a manufacturer, if you are a hospital that has a system deployed, we want to showcase that and create connections among this cohort of mature entities, right? And I think that's also a theme for this global initiative. So it's all about making sure we have these, we connect as many dots as possible to increase the likelihood for this cross-pollination, because it doesn't make sense, right, that we talk about all these things in interesting and smart and insightful ways in the research side, and then do the same thing on the kind of policy and global community side. What has to happen is that these things also intersect, and from this intersection, we take those groups that can do the thing that we actually set out to do in the beginning, which is using this technology for impact.
I did an interview with Eugenio Zaccarelli, and he sort of heads up innovation for CVS Health. CVS Health, by the way, is the world's largest healthcare company. And I introduced him to some people within IT because he said, I want to help with this healthcare initiative. Have you talked to him at all, or I should do a connection?
No, I haven't met him, but he sounds like a very fascinating compatriot in this direction.
Yeah, he even built a system with his team, which was used in the US on the COVID side. He's been experimenting with generative AI as well.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and he's got the Forbes 30 under 30 and all these different kind of recognitions for a very young researcher. But he also has an implementation innovation part, right? And he does that within CVS Health, which, as I mentioned, is the world's largest healthcare company. And I know there were some kind of challenges where I did introductions, but it just wasn't finding a place to kind of insert, or maybe there's delays in getting back to him. When I last tagged him, talked to him, DM'd him, he said, no, it looks like he's got a place, but your work and what he does is probably a really great fit because he's a coder as well. Like, he does stuff and he wants to do stuff. So post interview, and once the interview goes out, then I'll use his interview and your interview and introduce you to, because
Perfect.
Because I'm pretty sure he'd be interested in your summit too.
Nice, perfect. That sounds amazing. And also, if now with this global initiative starting, there is obviously room and some vacuum to also shape that. So if he's looking for entry points, I'm happy to chat, and I'm sure there's enough work to do in this space that we better connect as many communities as possible to make sure all people who want to create the impact have a higher chance of doing that.
Yeah, and he's also CVS Health, world's largest healthcare company. I think they're like the 5th largest Fortune 5 company in the world or something.
They are crazy big, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, everything US and healthcare, it's usually right at very large, and or North America broadly. So yeah, for sure, very interesting personality.
Okay, so I'll do that post interview, but I want to wait till this interview goes out so then I can use your interview as an anchor, and then I'll just connect you two through the interview so that you know each other. I have 2 more questions and then the interview is over. Do you have a time limit, by the way, because you're at the top of the hour, or can we go a little bit over?
We can go a little further, but I have to leave 15 minutes past because actually I have to catch a flight. I'm in Zurich today. No. I mean, I enjoy this so much. I'm sad that this is like a hard time cut, but my train leaves so I'm like at 7 p.m. and I have to leave here from the office at 7:15 because I'm flying to Berlin tonight, and my flight leaves from Zurich in the evening.
Okay, so I only have 2 more questions, and
No, that's perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, so the next question is I shouldn't even call it generative AI, because that term can be used with synthetic data and it can be used for these large language models and diffusion models. So let's use the term large foundation models because it's kind of more more of an umbrella term. What are your views about the large foundation models? And Gemini has been announced, and I believe it's going to be released this year. And that's where DeepMind is sort of integrating it with these large foundation models, and they say it's going to have planning, or I get the feeling it's going to have planning and memory and kind of more capabilities. And GPT-5 will be coming out sometime in the future, and you have Palm 2 already released with Bard, and then you have all of these open source models like Alpaca, Llama, Alpaca, Vicuna, and all its variations, and Orca a few weeks ago from Microsoft, and more. I mean, there's just so many. How do you keep up, right?
It's a zoo, yes.
Where is that going?
Well, I mean, I think we already see some of the implications, and I mean that's a bit of a, everybody has their own biased lens of looking on this, right? People in ML usually probably look at it also from a infrastructure and the challenges of deploying and maintaining these kind of systems, just in terms of cost, and then if you, overlay this to like a business model. So in that sense, I think we already see some of the utility these models can provide. So for me, for example, personally, I like my journey there has been to really hone in on those types of tasks where it adds value, right? And if you use GPT-4, for example, with the code interpreter, it's already it's pretty damn useful. There is no way around it to say that, right? So it's a niche. I think maybe still a niche use case if you kind of extrapolate that across all kinds of activities or also jobs that people hold. But that's the one where I feel already the impact, because I see myself coming back to it and using it and speeding up my workflow. So the impact, I think there is no question. It's already there, but it's also not as encompassing as maybe some people project or want us to, I think, believe. That at least is my opinion. And that, again, just from anecdotes and looking around me, you can see it's the impact will be correlated with the kind of pace or the rate of change in people's habits, and that's usually not a very very high slope, but it's usually gonna go gradually, right? Because people have their ways of doing things, and then there's the, I think, kind of third aspect to it, which is kind of ways in which it can enhance or change the rate limit in different applications, all right? Whether when you think about communication, so there's this meme now that why don't we just send each other bullet points instead of one person coming up with bullet points and blowing it up to a text, and then another person using a chat GPT to kind of condense it back to bullet points. So I'm like cautious on these types of aspects, but because I think that we will have to really see how this plays out in the long run. I don't think that all newspapers are going out of business in the next 2 years because they still have some, there is this editorial component, and we have to find our ways with this technology, and then we will find out, how things turn out. But making very bold claims, I think, leave that to the companies who need to get the VC funds to keep the show running. That's their job to do. But for a realistic, I think, assessment, I'm more inclined to say, okay, there's some applications where the impact is already, crystal clear, and others it seems a bit slower than some people want to make us believe. And let's just, take it step by step and be aware and go through life with open eyes, but also open to see what this technology can bring.
I know within my communities, we're really excited about seeing it in Big AI and also in Office 365,
right,
because then it's practical, right? I mean, it'd be to generate, for example, PowerPoint slides from a document and things like that. But
yes.
So Louis, the last question is your final recommendations to the audience, and then you got to go so you can catch your flight.
Thanks so much. Right. So I would say my the big three topics that we touched upon also condense into what I would recommend others to look at or be involved in, or if they're looking for ways to engage, to participate in that, right? So it's the infrastructure side. We need that that's the kind of fertilizer for impact, or kind of the hardware on which it can run. So we need to have some kind of convergence on that level, and make sure we solve the right problems. But the right problems we can also only solve with buy-in from different communities, right? And that's this other layer that we talked about. You are very in tune with the UN ecosystem, the ITU, all your work with for good, and I feel like that's something we should all be trying to do more, is having those intersections, because like I said, in my point of view, it's a lost opportunity if we only have the policy or the business or the research people sitting in their own stew. We need to have that intersection in order to work on the right problems with the right technology and get the resources to do this stuff, right? And that's I think this other kind of final layer to it. What I also hope we can be able to contribute to with the global initiative is to come up with good mechanisms and good templates to enable this type of dynamic resource allocation. So my vision or recommendation for this component, and it's a thing for us people working in technology or engineering, it's we have a natural tendency to shy away from like the bureaucratic stuff, and I think that's a good instinct to have, and usually because you can burn a lot of valuable lifetime on these types of things. But we also need to realize that this is some of the stuff that really matters in order to enable high impact. And I hope with the global initiative and these other communities that we talked about, we can make some progress on making sure that the resources go to the groups that know what needs to be done and deliver that impact quicker, so that can actually benefit all of us.
So Louis, thank you for coming in. You're just doing magnificent, wonderful, outstanding work, and you continue to have outsized contributions throughout the world. So thank you for sharing your insights with the audience.
Stephen, thank you so much for hosting me here. It was a pleasure to spend this time with you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you hopefully soon again, the latest at the next AI for Good Summit or somewhere in cyberspace.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.